Hello. So my name is Brendan Ryan, and this is my honors contract for Sociology 352, Social Change. Today I will be talking about the theory of social change that I picked from the notes is Karl Marx's materialistic perspective regarding social change. So his perspective was centered on this idea of capitalism having a negative impact on the proletariat, or basically the masses and the workers. He believed that there was contradictions between the forces of production owned by the bourgeoisie and the social relations of production, so those involving the workers. He believed that intense competition between capitalists would lead them to upgrade their technologies while minimizing labor costs. And within that minimizing of the cost, workers would become increasingly exploited. And then having become increasingly exploited and immiserated, these workers would then eventually revolt and have a revolution and take over the economy and reorganize it as suited for themselves, and so that they would have control over the means of production, and that would dismantle capitalism and institute a sort of communism or socialism, depending on how far you take Marx's theories. He did not see such a change as being inevitable in the short term, but he did view it as a very probable impact of capitalism in the long run, that eventually the workers would become fed up and they would revolt against it. So, but to get an idea of how his teachings were first instituted, I think it's really instructive to look and see where he grew up and how he was impacted in that sense. So he was born on May 5th, in 1818 in Trier, which is in present-day Germany. It was a town that was at the time part of the Kingdom of Prussia, in a section of Prussia referred to as the Rhineland. It's right on the border with, it was right on the border then for Prussia, and today Trier is right on the border between Germany and Luxembourg. And as a border town, its influence was much stronger with that of the French than that with the Prussians, and so there was a very contentious political climate in Trier. And as such, many of the residents of Trier were more French in terms of their political beliefs. I believe that at a certain gathering of politicians, they were the only section that had only left-leaning Republicans representing their district. So it was a very left-leaning French inspired, Enlightenment-inspired region of Prussia, and Marx read such French philosophers as Voltaire and Rousseau from a very young age. Now, religion was also a big issue for him because Catholicism was being pushed by the Prussians, but he was from a Protestant family. Now, he himself was never very religious, and he would famously go on to call religion the opiate of the masses and criticize it in that way. But because he was viewed, because his family was Protestant, and he was not viewed as, he was viewed, and he was not Catholic, he was viewed as dangerous by the Catholic community in that town, and so he was always kind of given more scrutiny. Now, in school, he was never, and somewhat surprisingly, he was never a particularly great student from what people understand, but he was taken in by a particular teacher called Baron Ludwig von Westphalen. He kind of took him in under his wing, and he pushed a much more progressive agenda than the one that he was receiving at home from his already left-leaning French-inspired family. He got a very progressive idea from the Baron, and that then influenced him when he went to college at the University of Bonn, where he studied politics and philosophy, and there, kind of building off of that progressive stance, he became a real proponent of Hegelianism, and with the real basis of that being that what is the theoretical should be based off of the practical. So any assertions of the way things should be or what is possible should be based off of what actually happens in real phenomena. And also, while studying philosophy, he sort of developed a conception of human nature that basically stipulated that to work for humans means simply to take your subjective experience and then to objectify it in the world, and that because we are conscious of ourselves, and that is the way that we find the most fulfillment in taking what is in us and then making it real in the real world. And so to him, work was this unalienable sacred right where it was kind of the most human thing in the world to him. And so now you can start to see with that his basis for his critiques of capitalism, where he thought that because capitalism makes labor a means to an end, the end being getting a wage that provides the subsistence of the worker, that it distorts the nature of what work actually is in a really, really harmful way. Now, he went into greater deal in this in much of his writings. His most famous ones were Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto. And he ultimately believed that in all of those writings, but probably most fervently put in the manifesto, that the workers would become so oppressed that they would eventually rise up and realize their status as being oppressed and not take it anymore. And they would overthrow the status quo and institute communism, and where the workers themselves were the owners of the means of production, instead of in capitalism where the capitalists are. There's no hierarchy there, in the sense that there's one group that is kind of, the word he would use is enslaving the majority of people. Instead, you have a sort of communal essence of work and how things are structured in society. So his arguments regarding his critiques of capitalism, his idea of this very materialistic sense of change, of the actual material conditions under which laborers suffer, and not in this, well, for him it's suffering, but the actual conditions under which they live, ultimately being the important part of then creating a philosophy of what is the ideal political system or social system, and that basically people will revolt if there's not a system that caters to their needs and desires. His arguments regarding that capitalism is something that needs to be revolted against, they continue to resonate today. Now, well, not as far off as communism, which obviously has been instituted in countries across all the globe. It's been in Russia, famously, and also in Cuba, and those are very authoritarian regimes, so it's not been nearly as successful or in really the way that Marx, I think, really would have had those types of governments be instituted. They were much more authoritarian and far less leftist in viewpoint, and they never promoted the sort of liberal thinking that I think is so prominent in his philosophy and in his writings. And you can even see it today in the United States, where even though he didn't win the nomination for his party, Bernie Sanders, who there's been some debate about how socialist his policies are, but he is a self-described socialist, and there was a great number of people that were inspired by him, and there does seem to be a bit of a movement, particularly from young people, towards more of the workers' rights-oriented politics that is prevalent in Marx's writings. And then another potentially interesting takeaway that I think ultimately might be the tipping point, if this is the beginning of the revolution for Marx, this movement toward the acceptance of socialist candidates, then I think another interesting point that might lead us to the tipping point for a major revolution is the increasing nature of automated work in capitalism, where you have technology instead of people. doing jobs and eventually taking away jobs that people once had, because it's easier and more cost effective for the capitalist to not have to pay human labor. And so I think that maybe in the future, human workers may find themselves increasingly unemployed, and they might, without work, they might start the sort of revolt that Marx ultimately talked about. And it would be in line with his thinking that the revolution didn't happen swiftly. It was a process, and it eventually happened. And I think that's a very interesting potential reading to his view of philosophy. So yeah, those are my real take.